Greetings! In this lesson, we'll learn how to create a paint effects tree from scratch. We'll create it very simply and sparsely initially, just to keep things simple, and then we can bump it up and make it more dense. And this will really be predicated on your processor power, how dense you can make your tree. Let's get started. We'll come to the modeling mode, over to Generate, Get Brush, Modeling Mode, Generate, Get Brush, and you should be in your airbrush folder, the very first folder of the paint effects, and we're going to use our default paint. So I'll just click on default paint and make sure our grid is available to us. And you know from previous lessons that we can paint. I'll hit undo. You can hold the B key and scrub left right to change the brush size, right? So that's painting, but we're going to draw out a tube from our stroke, and that will give us the basis for our branching tree. I'm going to click and drag just a short stroke there. I'll go ahead and close my paint effects, and I'm also going to select the pick tool just so that I don't accidentally keep painting or don't accidentally paint again. And we'll look at the attribute editor. I'm in Maya Classic. Here is the attribute editor. And we have our stroke brush, stroke, brush. Let me close these. Yeah, brush and brush. So we'll be working in these two tabs. Be aware of which tab we're in or which tab you're asked to be in. In this lesson, we'll primarily be in the brush tab, but in some of the upcoming lessons, we'll be working more in the stroke tab. So be aware of which tab you're in the attribute editor. First thing we'll do is come down to tubes. We'll open that up and we'll just click on tube. And so this draws some tubes out of that stroke. We'll come back to the stroke, and where it says stamp density, we're going to pull that down till we're left with just one tube, and that will be the basis for our tree. So in my case, it was 0.466. I can't give you an absolute number because it depends on the strength or the length of your initial stroke. Come back to brush, right? We're down here in tubes. And this first set, creation and width scale, this is the tube over the course of the full length. And so we'll continue to come back here. We'll put in some values here initially, but we'll continue to update those as we make other changes down below in growth and behavior. But for now, let's dial this in. First thing we'll do is stand it up straight. So down in width scale, we have elevation max, and we'll put that all the way up. Now, if I bring the min all the way up, it's straight up and down. The min and max, and you'll see that there's lots of min-max combinations. That is for variability, not just for our single tree, but ultimately we'll create a grove of trees off of this basic brush. And the min-max values will give us variability between those. So if we had min and max the same, all of our trees that we create for that eventual grove would be the exact same straightness. So I'm going to put the elevation down a little bit, and then some of our trees will lean left, some of them will lean right, some will be straight up, and everything in between. Okay, so that's elevation, min, and max. And then let's talk about the length. I'm going to start with 12. We'll come back and change this. The primary reason being, that looks very long. But when we bend, right, this is the total length all the way out to the furthest branch. So we'll probably come back and increase that. And then once again, we want to have min and max set. We'll come to tube width, and I'm going to make that 1. So you can see that there. And then segments, I'm going to change this to 20. And that just gives you more detail, right? This would be incredibly detailed, but probably really tax your system. So I'll go 20. And again, if you had a very slow computer, you might have to pull this back down to 10 or something like that. So we've got our segments. Oops, I wanted that at 20. We've got our max length, and we've got our tube width all set. Now we're going to be working just as a silhouette. So I'm going to close the tubes, and let's open shading. And then under tube shading, yours might be closed, open that tube shading, and we'll just make it all black. Just keep a simple silhouette. I may have mentioned we'll come back in an upcoming video and we'll apply bark and leaf textures and get a very pretty realistic looking tree when we add those good textures. Coming back down to tubes, and we're going to slide all the way down to behavior. And there are displacement and spiral and bend are some that you can play with. If you look at bend here, pretty straightforward, right? We can just bend that back and forth. And we want just a little bit of bend for our tree. If you were doing something kind of cartoony or Dr. Seuss or something like that, you could really exaggerate that, but we're just going to give it a little bit. And then I'm going to open displacement, and there are two attributes here, wiggle and curl. We can really crank that to see what it does, right? So that really wiggled out there. I'm just going to give it a little bit. And then we have curl, right, which works in conjunction, and we'll just curl that maybe less, about there. And you're dollying around. And so that gives us some bend to our tree. Once again, we'll make changes up above. We'll have to come back down, make changes back and forth. So every variable, every value that you input will change all the other values. So it's a lot of back and forth as you develop this. So I'm coming back up to tubes. Right here we are, tubes. And we'll begin with our branch. So we're going to come to growth, and we'll click on branches. And by default, we have 2 split. And let's go ahead and use 3. So I've got 3 branches with 3 additional structures, and that allows us to talk about the split max depth. So split max depth on the branch will allow you, right, you can see how many you can get. And we'll go, let's say, just to keep it pretty simple, we'll go about there. Now, split max depth, and then I had come down to split angle, right? So we can raise that or have it weeping. And then split bias is how high that goes. And the split bias is one where if you pull that up, you might want to change the overall max. So maybe we said 15, make that a little bit higher. So right, changing one thing down here might mean that we want to go back up and change that again. So where do those branches start? I'm on the split bias. Split angle, right? So those are your main ones. And then we can play with these other ones. The branch dropout, we'll just leave that to 0. Split random, you could employ that if you wanted. The split angle we talked about. Split twist, that just twists it around. I'm just going to leave that at 0. Split size decay, and split bias. Now if we look out here, these tubes are open at the end, and that'll give us an opportunity to come back up, right? Again, back up to tubes, creation, and width scale. Now the tube width 1 and the tube width 2 are these here. So this is the 1. If I came and made that tube width 1, 2, right, it's 2. And if I made the tube width 2, let's say also 2, right, and we made the bias, right, so they're thick all the way through. So we'll come back and put that back to 0.1, and I'll put this back to 1. You know what, let's say 1.5. And how can we also have the ability to give some difference to those tube widths with our width scale. So I'm just going to click in here, and you can see that I can pull that new anchor. If I pull it all the way to the end, what we see is this value, tube width 1, 1.5, is 100%. And then whatever the second tube width, I've shut it all the way off, right? If we put it up here, we get that maximum value. And what this allows you to do is to change. So, right, we can make it thick way up, or we can make it thin, right, by changing that. And maybe we want, right, I'll put this so that we get a nice kind of flare there at the bottom. And maybe we want those branches to be a little thicker as it goes out. So imagine if you flip that, right? You're seeing the contour of these values, the min-max of the tube width 1, tube width 2. This is tube width 1, max value, and it's starting out at max. Tube width 2, all the way to 0.1, and we've got that coming very thin there at the end. So those are our branches, right? Once we created the branches, we wanted to come back and change our width scale, customize that a little bit. And now we're ready to create some twigs. We'll click twigs, and they're just kind of randomly placed there. What I first want to do, we'll open the twigs, is come down to twig start. And let's have those twigs start further up the branches. And we'll come to the angle, and I want them just angling upward. Right, so we've got that. We can create some variability in here. The length, you've got your base width and the tip. Twig dropout, if we wanted to add some dropout there, I'll leave that down. Twig twist and stiffness. So you can play with those, get in there nice and tight, and see what happens if we wanted to maybe give ourselves an additional twig there. And so now we've got the structure, and we'll add our leaves. We'll come back up here to growth. We did branches, we did twigs, now we'll come to leaves. And just gives us a handful, so let's come down and talk about the leaves. First we'll start like we did with the twigs a moment ago with leaf start. So let's pull those up so that they're mainly on the branches out here. We don't want to pull it all the way, that puts them all on the tip. So you know, 0.95 would be good for us. And there's actually quite a few things we're going to change with the leaves. Let's get in here nice and tight. And I'm also going to, right, we're working in silhouette, so we'll just turn off that color for now. And let me mention one thing. If we're using sprites or we're using a picture of a leaf, right, if we were going for something really photorealistic, we could use an actual photo of a leaf and apply that. Now we would want to apply it on a rectangle. So let's say we had these both the same, 0.1 and 0.1. Right now we have a rectangle, and that leaf picture could sit on there squarely. And the alpha would create the effective cutout. I'll leave those at 1, but really what we want to do is create that same kind of profile that we were talking about a moment ago with the trunk. So we can pull down where the leaf starts and add an anchor and pull down where it begins. And we can create the profile of our leaf. Now there are 5 segments. We'll go up to 7. Again, if you have a slow computer, you might want to go the other way down. But 7 is kind of right in the middle for getting a nice leaf shape without using an alpha channel photo. And the other thing we want is flatness. So come to leaf flatness. Right now, these leaves are completely flat. So 1 is on, so we'll pull that to the left just to the point where they become dimensional, right? And now that'll give us some better blending, or excuse me, bending with that additional information. All right, back to the width, right? We could make that fatter at the bottom. That's just making this value the max value that it could be. And let's say we want our leaves to look like that. The overall length, we can pull that down. It's relative to the whole tree. And again, we're building this sparsely, and I would say that's about the right length. We could bump this up. You don't want to scrub, because if you put a value in that's too great for your computer all at once, you're likely to crash. So I'll just type in a number 2 there. So we've got our leaf start, our leaf angle. Let's get in there tight and see that. So we can, maybe we want those pointing out. Leaf twist. Twirl. We played with flatness just a moment ago. So size decay and then size random, right? So we don't want these to all look like they're exactly the same size, exactly the same age. So leaf size random, leaf size random. And that is it for dialing in your parameters. And what we can do, let's come down to the bottom. And we had the curl, right? You can kind of see that. And we had the wiggle. Play with that. And the bend, right? You can bend that all the way over. Make it dance. I'll put that about there. Okay, so here this would be our sparse tree, right? Most computers can handle something at about this level of detail. So you definitely want to save this scene, and then write a series of increment and save as you experiment to get the exact tree that you like. Let's come back, and we're going to, as I mentioned at the very beginning, bump things up. So we're coming to branches. We've got 3. Let's see what 4 does. Right, so 4, and then 5. And that took a moment, didn't it? But once it's calculated, it's going pretty quickly. And you probably don't want to go much more than 6 branches, but that'll give us a nice thick tree. You see it working on it there. And hopefully we didn't crash. No. And we've got it. And it'll take a moment to update. And now that I have that, so here as we're kind of problem solving, I don't like these long branches, right? There's too much leaf at the end. I want those maybe a little bit more evenly distributed. I don't want to change those attributes with this cranked up to 6. You can see even just selecting it. So I'm going to put that back to 3. And we'll come back, right, and I will pull some of those attributes back down. And let's give a couple of more. Yeah. So I just wanted some more leaves towards the evenly distributed. So here you might increment and save, right? We've made a change. And I'm not going to go all the way up to 6. So 6 looked like it was pretty close to what this machine can handle. So I'll put that to 5. Oh, excuse me, I'm in the wrong place. Come up to branches. We'll go branches 5. Let that work on it. And there we go. So we have a nice tree silhouette. All right, we'll talk about rendering in the upcoming section. And then in another video, we'll talk about how we can distribute this brush of a tree to create a grove. All right, questions in the discussion. Okay, so we have our high-res tree paint effect, and we'll convert it into a poly so that we can render it and cast shadows. We'll come to Modify. First, make sure you have the stroke selected. Modify, Convert, Paint Effects to Polys. And we'll open this dialog box. Modify, Convert, Paint Effects to Polys. And just make sure that Quad Output is selected. We want to output as Quad Mesh. We'll hit Convert. And if you take a look here, your original paint effect still exists. It's hidden. You can make adjustments to it. With something this complex, it would take a moment. But when we have simpler paint effects and we convert them to polys, you can still go back to the original stroke, make adjustments, and it will update to your poly. Just to make it clear that we're not going to maintain that association, I'm going to go ahead and delete this. Make sure you have your file already saved. But I'll delete this. And we'll go ahead and delete all of our history. Edit, delete all by type history. This is unique to this particular lesson, so this isn't something that you do every time you've finished a paint effect. We're going to do a render, we're going to cast shadows from our poly. So we don't need the history and we don't need the original paint stroke, but you should have that saved as a file. Edit, delete all by type history, and we can open this group and we see there is the tree and there are the leaves. Now let's render this, right? This was just meant to be a graphic representation of a tree, a silhouette. So we'll pick our perspective and come down, right? You'll come into the attribute editor for your perspective. Come down to environment, and you're starting off black most likely, and just scrub that up to white. Now if we were to render, we don't see any shadow, so we'll create a plane just for the purpose of receiving a shadow. Also, we're working in Maya software. We're going to be tackling Arnold Render in the coming weeks, but for these trees this week, we're just going to create a Maya software version of the render. So make sure you're in Maya software. We see there's no shadow, so let's create a plane in order for it to receive that shadow. So we'll crank this up. Let's make it fairly large. Our tree is big here. We could bring this down a bit into range. So scaled my group, and then I've got my plane nice and large here. Looks like 270. Now if I were to render right now, once again, I wouldn't see any shadow. I see that. We're gonna address this hard edge here in a moment. But let's create a light. So we're gonna create light, directional light. I can hit the T key, right? And let's hit the 4 key so we can see a little bit better. There is my directional light, right? The T key gave me the manipulator, which gives me the aim and the light itself. T key for manipulator. I'm gonna go back to the 5 shaded, and let's turn on lights. So there are lights on, and let's turn on shadows. So we can pull this up and you see that. And we're going to place it where our main light is in our typical standard 3-point light setup, which is 45 degrees up and over. That's a good place to place a light. We're not going to worry about a background light or a fill light since this is just a monochromatic image. But we will place this in the standard main light position and give us that nice shadow cast back. Now if we render, we'll see that the shadow isn't there. By default, our directional light came with ray trace shadows on, but we didn't turn ray trace shadows on in the render settings. And we're not going to use ray tracing for this particular image. It would take very long to render, and the quality of the shadow wouldn't be that much better. But because it would have to cast through all those leaves, it would take quite a while. Remember that we use here for these initial lessons depth map shadows. So let's just review where we are. I've got the directional light selected. I also have the T key manipulator on, so that's why we see where it's pointed. I'm in the attribute editor, and I see directional light here. And if we pull down, we'd see that ray trace shadows is on. But ray trace shadows isn't on in my render settings, so that's why we don't see that shadow there. We'll use depth map shadows. Depth map shadows are just a very quick and easy way to render a shadow. We'll just crank up that resolution, and we'll crank up the filter size, which will soften the edge just slightly. And so now, without changing anything in our render settings, I can render this and we'll see we have that shadow. Let's address the plane. We're going to make this just completely black and white, and we'll get rid of this hard horizon line, right? That hard horizon line makes CG environments seem very artificial. So we'll always, in our environments, think about what the viewer is seeing on the horizon. But I'm going to right-click and pull down to Assign New Material. This is for my plane. I have the plane selected, if you see there in the outliner. And I'm pulling down to Assign New Material. And we'll just choose a Lambert. We don't need any reflectivity or anything like that. Now, let's go through a series of attributes to get this white. If I scrub that up to white, you might think, well, we'll have a perfectly white plane. But it's still a little gray there, and that's because our diffuse is down at 0.8. So if you want pure color, you can put your diffuse up to 1. This is rare when you do that. It fits in the scene. Colors do at 0.8 a little bit better, but we're trying to get this completely white. Now, if we render this, we'll see it's still not quite white. And there's a number of ways we could handle this. We could light link an ambient light just to the plane and crank that up the way that we did light linking in the red ball. Right, it would be the opposite. We were taking the ambient away from the plane. Here we could take the ambient and have it set only on the plane and then find the right amount to make the plane white. Another option, we can turn up incandescence. So I'm going to turn that up to about there. And we want it enough so that it really brightens that ground plane but doesn't get rid of the shadow. We'll render this. Now we have it completely white and we just have our shadow. And let's turn on our resolution gate, and we'll make sure that this is filling the view. And I also want to, well, let's just verify that. So we have a nice composition here. Yeah, and actually, you know, we'll just turn this one in. So we have our poly conversion, and we created a plane. We've created a directional light. We have that in the main light position. We're using depth map shadows on that directional light. And we've got a pure black and white with a gray shadow monochromatic image of our complex tree. So this is where you will save this. And let me just mention one thing. As I look here, there's some faceting. Right, it's not entirely smooth. So let me digress here from the lesson for just a moment and talk about the fact that we can use our poly tools on this. We've converted it to a poly. So let me come to the modeling mode. We have multi-cut. Remember that the multi-cut plus the control key gives us our insert edge loop. So let's insert some edge loops here. And you can see there I've got soft select on. Tap the B key to turn that off and on, remember? And hold down the B key to make this bigger or smaller. If your brush is way too large, you can double click the move tool. And then usually if you just hit reset on soft select, you can bring down that fall off radius or brush size to something you can see, holding down the B key and scrubbing left and right. So I'm going to double click this edge, tap the B key to show you that I've got that edge selected. I double clicked it. I'll get rid of my resolution gate here temporarily. And if we scale that right, we'll get kind of a hard edge there. So I do want some soft select. So I'll tap the B, I'll bring it down. And we could scale that. I'm going to bring that down even more. We'll scale that up. We could double click this, and right, we can just get, with our B key large enough, we can get some generalized shape. Maybe we also want to, we want to rotate some of these. I'm going to bring the B key down, right? We could rotate that, maybe scale that up a little bit. And so you can, because it's a poly, we can manipulate that trunk. I'm also going to make sure that it's sitting flat on the ground. We'll look here in this orthographic view and I can see that it's not. So we'll position that to be right on the ground. You could come in with your vertices, right? If I just wanted to, I'll turn the soft select off. Maybe we want to move these around, hit the B key. Maybe we want this one, come back to selecting edges, scale that one down, move it over. So because it's a poly, you can get in there, and I just noticed when we were about to render that these here looked a little faceted, and I wanted to fix that. Multi-cut, I'll put some multi-cuts in here. And we'll just kind of, I had my multi-cut still selected. Make sure to switch back to your select tool, and we'll make this a little smoother, a little less clunky. There we go. So from that view, that curvature there looks much nicer than the original conversion. Okay, back to rendering. If your tree ended up being fine, that's okay, but I think that little digression was all right because we got to see that we can just use our modeling toolkit directly on this poly conversion from a paint effect, which is really, really nice. So there we are again. We'll render it. That looks good, and then so now we could bump it all up if we wanted to come into render settings, and we'll come down, and let's actually do this as a square. Let's say we'll do this as a 2K square, and the only other thing we want to change is we'll come to production quality. Now this is going to slow down our render time, but all those detailed leaves will look much nicer at this larger size. And we'll fill the frame, and this should be our final render. Okay, so that took a little bit of time. If your processor isn't able to keep up, you could render it a little bit smaller, maybe not bump it all the way up to production quality. There's an intermediate quality option there. But one of the functions of this lesson is to see how much detail you can add to these paint effects, how much your processor can handle. I have a very fairly robust desktop computer, and you could see that this level of detail was really taxing it. So I know this is about as much as I can do in terms of detail with that paint effects on this particular machine. Be sure to save it. Save color manage. Well, color manage wouldn't have any effect in this version, but always a good idea to click it. Last name first, first name last, and save it as a JPEG and upload it. Follow the Canvas instructions on the assignment upload. Have a good one.